Thank you, Glenn. Welcome, one and all, to what may be the first assembly of advocates of mitochondrial replacement therapy. We are here today on account of the estimated 1,000 US children who are born annually with mitochondrial DNA disease. As you know, these diseases can be and frequently are very serious afflictions. Some of the children may end up wheelchair-bound. Many others may, in fact, end up bedridden. And all too often, these children are oxygen-starved. And as many of you know, many of these children succumb at an early age after an agonizing course. What their parents are going through is another matter altogether. Although mitochondrial DNA diseases are presently beyond the reach of contemporary medicine, they are amenable to prevention by way of mitochondrial replacement therapy, which a relatively recent National Academy of Medicine report deemed both ethically permissible and eminently testable. Armed with these insights, our goals for today are to note the plight of the children and their families, to emphasize the high quality of US science about which you will be hearing shortly, to note the US readiness for clinical trials at this time, and to explore the abrogation of the US MRT ban, and finally declare, if possible, the consensus of the assembled here today. Before we get underway, however, we may do well to recall that mitochondrial replacement therapy, or at least the conceptualization thereof, was born in the USA. The year was 1995 when 4 professionals ended up publishing a paper in the Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics titled "Germline Therapy to Cure Mitochondrial Disease: Protocol and Ethics of In Vitro Ovum Nuclear Transplantation." 3 of those 4 individuals are with us here today. Those are Dr. Donald Rubenstein, Dr. Eric Schoen, and Dr. Michael Zinnemann. Thank you for being with us here today. Dr. David Tomasma sadly passed away in 2002. By 2014, it seemed for all the world that the FDA was at least willing to consider mitochondrial replacement therapy. I say so based on the fact that the FDA organized a 2-day conference in Bethesda, Maryland, to discuss oocyte modification in assisted reproduction for the prevention of transmission of mitochondrial disease or treatment of infertility. However, it was not all that long after that meeting that Congress passed and the President signed into law a renewable rider, the relevant language of which was that none of the funds made available to the FDA may be used to acknowledge a submission for research in which a human embryo is modified to include heritable genetic modification. As such, this language effectively precluded the conduct of any clinical trials of mitochondrial replacement therapy under the watchful eye of the FDA, and by extension, precluded the potential approval of this technology by the FDA at a later date. The last, indeed fourth, renewal of the rider transpired as recently as February the 15th of this year. By now, many of you realize, and you may well have realized this some time ago now, that the language of the rider makes no mention of mitochondria. The term never appears in the rider, which makes us wonder whether or not the rider was primarily aimed at heritable editing of the nuclear genome, which, as you recall, in 2015 was largely represented as a threat from this paper, which emanated from Sun Yat-sen University in China. Little did we know at the time what we are about to encounter in 2018. Be that as it may, in hindsight, MRT is probably an unwitting casualty, collateral damage, if you will, caught in a crossfire of the renewable rider, and in a sense fits here only because it technically qualifies under the definition of heritable genetic modification. The provenance of the renewable rider is the House Appropriations Subcommittee for Agriculture, Rural Development, Food and Drug Administration, and related agencies, the chairman of which, at the time that the rider was passed, was Representative Robert Aderholt from the state of Alabama, who, based on his public statement, views heritable genetic modification as a pro-life matter, which necessitated the legislation. Skirting that argument for the moment, I will simply state for the record that maternal spindle transfer, or MST for short, which is exclusively the mode of MRT deployed in the United States, thus far, of course, in the research context, is, if anything, embryo-sparing because it only deals with the human oocyte. This is very different than what's transpiring in the United Kingdom, wherein our colleagues rely on pronuclear transfer, which obviously has an impact on the human embryo. The current makeup of the House Appropriations Subcommittee, which is at the heart of this issue since the 2018 election, is dominated by 7 Democrats who are complemented by 4 Republicans, 3 of whom are on record opposing germline modification in general and mitochondrial replacement therapy in particular. The latter applies to Representative Fortenberry from the state of Nebraska and to Dr. Harris, the representative from the state of Maryland. As we meet today, the fiscal year 2020 draft of the subcommittee appropriation bill is still pending. That is not to say that it's not being worked on. It is undoubtedly being worked on. It simply has not been released or posted in any fashion. As almost anybody in this room, I'm certain, recognizes, what happens to this draft bill and what language is included in it will determine, of course, the fate of mitochondrial replacement therapy in the United States this year, next year, and potentially beyond. Let me close by thanking you all for joining us here today for what I think we can all agree is both an important and good cause. Thank you very much.